Buenas tardes con todos. Mi nombre es Mario Velázquez y tengo el honor de desempeñarme como presidente del CFA Society Perú. En nombre de nuestro directorio acá presente, es un privilegio darles la bienvenida a todos ustedes en un evento que marca un hito para nuestra institución y para toda la comunidad financiera peruana. Quiero agradecer sinceramente la presencia de todos nuestros miembros, candidatos al programa, estudiantes, profesionales del mercado, representantes de empresas, autoridades académicas, sponsors y amigos de la sociedad peruana. Su presencia nos honra y confirma el creciente interés de nuestra comunidad por seguir aprendiendo, intercambiando ideas y promoviendo los más altos estándares éticos y de excelencia profesional. Quisiera comenzar expresando nuestro más profundo agradecimiento al Pacifico Business School, nuestro host sponsor, por recibirnos en esta prestigiosa institución y acompañarnos en la realización del evento. Muchísimas gracias. Asimismo, agradecemos especialmente a la Raín Vial, creo que he visto a los amigos de la Raín allá al fondo. Muchas gracias. Ellos también han sido, nuestros main sponsors, y a nuestros sponsors oro, MFS Investment Management, Schroders, que están por ahí, Prep Securities y Tandem. Gracias, sin ustedes no hubiera sido posible traer al profesor. También quisiera expresar nuestro profundo agradecimiento al CFA Institute por el apoyo brindado y por trabajar junto a nosotros en hacer realidad esta visita. Gracias a este esfuerzo conjunto, hoy tenemos el privilegio de recibir al profesor Damodaran en Lima como parte de una gira sudamericana. Él viene de Bogotá el día de ayer y estará en Sao Paulo el día de mañana. Nada de esto habría sido posible sin el compromiso de todos ustedes. Quiero agradecer especialmente a los miembros del directorio del CFA, quienes durante meses han estado trabajando con mucha dedicación en la realización de este evento. Y como ustedes saben, es el CFA Institute, el CFA Perú, es una organización absolutamente voluntaria, sin fines de lucro. También deseo reconocer a nuestros voluntarios, cuyo profesionalismo, entusiasmo y espíritu de servicio hacen posible que el CFA Perú continúe creciendo y desarrollando iniciativas de alto impacto para nuestra comunidad. Hoy quisiera aprovechar para compartir con ustedes que el CFA Perú está viviendo una nueva etapa. Como directorio hemos asumido el compromiso de construir una sociedad cada vez más activa, más abierta, más cercana, más independiente y más relevante en el día a día de nuestros miembros. Por eso estamos trabajando para traer al Perú a los principales referentes internacionales de la industria, desarrollar actividades de formación, generar mayores oportunidades de networking, fortalecer nuestras alianzas estratégicas y crear espacios donde el intercambio de conocimientos contribuya al crecimiento del mercado financiero peruano. Nuestro compromiso es seguir ofreciendo más y mejores eventos con contenidos de excelencia y oportunidades que permitan a nuestros miembros mantenerse a la vanguardia de la industria. Creemos firmemente que una sociedad como la nuestra no se construye únicamente con grandes conferencias como esta, sino también creando comunidad comprometida, con aprendizaje continuo, con integridad y con desarrollo profesional. Y precisamente esa visión es la que nos reúne hoy día. Pocas personas han tenido un impacto tan profundo en la formación de profesionales en las finanzas como el profesor Damodaran. Sus libros forman parte de la biblioteca de prácticamente todos los que trabajamos en este mundo. Sus investigaciones han transformado la forma en que entendemos la valorización de las empresas y durante décadas han inspirado a miles de estudiantes, analistas, inversionistas y académicos alrededor del mundo. Para todos nosotros, escuchar hoy al profesor es un verdadero privilegio. Now I switch to English. And Professor, it's a true privilege to have you today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Peruvian welcome to Professor Aswath Damodaran. Thank you very much. Welcome.
I was asked to wait 10 seconds before I started. This is like my regular lecture hall, so I'm not used to all this formality because, it is what it is. Do I look like I'm wearing sunglasses? No, seriously, I'm asking because my glasses turned color and no, it's okay? Because I have another pair of glasses. I don't want you to think that I'm trying to hide my eyes from you. 2 hours sounds like a lot of time, but the strange thing that happens when you become a teacher is time. No matter how much time you give me, I can bullshit my way through that time. So here's what we're going to do. We're not going to make this a speech. I have zero interest in making the speech, and it'll be pointless. You know why? If you go to my YouTube channel, my life is YouTubed. You want a 2-hour talk on narrative and numbers? It's there already. Right? So if all you're doing is going to watch me talk, you don't need to come here. Yeah, you could watch it on YouTube. I want this to be as close to a classroom as I can make it. There's no Q&A at the end, but there'll be a Q&A all the way through. So if you have a question, put up your hand and I'm going to call on you. I know because of the acoustics of the room, people might not be able. If I can hear you, I will repeat what you asked me. But let's make this a class, right? I think that's the biggest advantage of doing things in person. So today's session is a session that has been a long time in the making. I started teaching in 1984. Okay. How many of you were born in 84 or before? Okay. So I've lost most of the room already, right? And in 1986, I came to NYU. And I've been there since. They can't get rid of me. And when I came to NYU, they gave me a class to teach. It's a class called Security Analysis. It's a class with a very long tradition. It had been taught in the 1950s at Columbia University by a guy called Ben Graham. And if you've never heard of Ben, you probably heard of his most famous student. Anybody? Warren Buffett. So this is a class that had been taught since the 1950s. I come in, assistant professor. They give me this class to teach. I take one look at the class. And I said, I'm not teaching this class. Most boring class ever. Because by 1986, it was showing its age. It was a collection of topics. It was 4 weeks on stocks, and 3 weeks on bonds, and 2 weeks on options and futures, and 5 weeks on institutional detail. Like what? There was an entire session on listing requirements for the New York Stock Exchange, a whole class. Teaching was so easy in the days before Wikipedia. You could actually come in and list out 14 items and people thought you were a genius. They took everything down. Today, if I tried that, people would be checking Wikipedia while I'm doing it, saying, it's right here. Why are you teaching this class? So I went to the head of my department and I said, I don't want to teach this class. He should have fired me on the spot. Insubordination, right? Assistant professor refusing to teach a class. But he's a good guy. He said, what would you like to teach instead? I said, I'd like to teach a class on valuation. I still remember what he told me. He said, don't do it. There isn't enough stuff in valuation to fill a class. You know what? 1986, he was absolutely right. There were no books on valuation unless you counted security analysis. Ben Graham's book. You know when that was published? Anybody want to make a guess? You don't have to give me an exact year. When do you think Security Analysis first edition was published? 1934. I want you to put yourself in 1934. What did the world look like? What had just happened over the previous few years? The Great Depression. If you read Security Analysis by Ben Graham, you come out of the Great Depression, what is your first priority as an investor. Safety, protection, and security analysis reeks of risk aversion. If you look at the entire book and you ask me to compress it into a line, what Ben Graham was looking for was a stock that looked like a bond. Big coupon or a dividend, predictable assets, and you can't nitpick him. You can say, why didn't Ben Graham value companies like Meta and Palantir? Because he lived in a different time and a very different perspective. But people were still teaching out of the book in 1986, right? Telling people that the value of a stock is the present value of the dividends you receive on the stock. Good luck with that. Especially with the kinds of companies that have trillion-dollar values that never pay a dividend. He said, don't teach this class. Not enough stuff. There were no books, no papers. There was no CFA, ASS. The alphabet soup of valuation things was not there. But I really, really wanted to teach this class. And I discovered very early in my academic life that if you want to get anything done at a university, the best way to do it is to do it subversively. Don't ask for permission. It's a dangerous path to go, because if you then say, no, somebody says, no, you're stuck. So I said, I'll teach a security analysis class. I walked into the classroom, closed the door, and this is 1986. There were no cameras in the classroom. They had no idea what I was doing in that room. I could be teaching cooking for all they knew. And if everybody got an A, nobody would complain. And I taught my first valuation class. It was fall of 1986. Spring of 2025 I taught valuation again. I teach 2 valuation sessions, one to the MBAs and one to the undergraduates. It's exactly the same class. And if you gave me a group of CEOs or CFAs or CFOs, I would teach exactly. Valuation at its core is simple. It shouldn't be morphing and changing just because of the audience. And in the spring of 2025, when I taught the class twice, it was my 59th and 60th semester teaching that class. And I'm going to say something about this class that's going to encapsulate both how I think about valuation and the genesis for what you're going to see in today's presentation. Everything I know about valuation, I've learned in the course of teaching this class. I'll give you a few examples. Fall of 1987, I'd been teaching 1 year. I was still a novice. I teach Mondays, Wednesdays. Why? Creature of habit. It was October 19th of 1987, a Monday. I go teach my class. I come back to my office. At that time, NYU's graduate business school was downtown in New York, right next to the American Stock Exchange. It was the building right next to it. My office was on the 9th floor. I look out of my office and I see that everybody from the exchange floor is out on the street. So what happened? Fire alarm went off. Does anybody know what happened on October 19th of 1987? But there have been so many Black Mondays, right? What was so black about this Black Monday? What happened on that day? The S&P 500 was down 22%. 22%, the entire index. We're not talking about an emerging market. This was the largest equity. You'd lost 1/5 of your value for the entire market in one day. One company, I understand, 5 companies, the entire market. Wednesday, I come back in front of my class, and guess what the first question I'm asked is? How do you explain, with your valuation tools, the entire market dropping by 22% in one day? I'd be lying if I said I had the answer, but I have this bad habit. I can't say that. I have to reason my way to that answer. So I said, And that was the day I started thinking about market crises and what causes them. The answer didn't come overnight. I still keep learning. But you know what causes market crises? It's not earnings changing overnight or cash flows changing. It's the price of risk. Why does the price of risk change overnight? Because people get scared. What causes them to be scared? Sometimes it's a real event. Sometimes it's an imagined event. But it stood me in good stead every time there's been a market crisis since. In fact, much of my thinking on equity risk premiums, and some of you might be familiar with my work on equity risk premiums, started because until that day, I did what everybody else did, which is what? Look at the last 75 years, take the average premium, say, that's what people have earned, let's move on, this is so easy. And I said, that can't be right. How can my equity risk premium stay at 5% as the world is melting down under me? And you get to the 1990s, and you get a phenomenon in markets, a phenomenon that we'd never seen in public equity markets before. Companies with small revenues, losing a lot of money, but with lots of potential coming into the market. You pause right there. Did those companies exist before the 1990s? Absolutely, but they were funded by venture capitalists. They didn't make it to the market. If you go back and look at Microsoft in 86 when it went public, or Apple in 1980 when it went public, these were companies that had fully formed business models. They were actually either on the verge of making money or making money already. But this was a new group of companies coming directly to public markets, and people had no idea what to do with them. Why? Metrics like PE ratio, which is what investors were using, didn't work because these companies had no earnings. I'm talking, of course, about the dot-com boom. I still remember the day in 1997. A student in my class puts up her hand and she says, can we value this company called Amazon.com? Luckily, I'd bought books on their online retail site the week before I'd heard of it. But it was a small company losing a lot of money, had gone public. And stupidly, I said yes. And over the course of that semester, I valued Amazon in class. And I'll make a confession. There was nothing in the existing valuation literature to help me value a company like Amazon. Everything you saw was for mature companies. In fact, in the mid-90s, you looked at valuation books, they were about valuing nice, mature companies, lots of history, and you put in the ratios and you came up with the numbers. Everything I had to estimate, from simple parameters like how risky are they, was a roadblock. And I kept a journal of every roadblock I ran into and how I got around that roadblock. I'm a pragmatist. I'm not going to let a roadblock, so I'm going to make my best judgment. I'm going to screw up sometimes. By the time I was done, the journal was 75 pages long. Shows you how many roadblocks I ran into. I never waste anything I write, so I slapped a title on that journal called The Dark Side of Valuation, Can Amazon.com Be Valued? It's still on my website if you go, the original 97. That then became a book called The Dark Side of Valuation about dot-com companies that came out in like 2001. And that book I revisited in 2009 because I discovered that the dark side beckons, not just with young companies, but any time you feel uncertain. What was different about 2009? By 2009, the 2008 crisis, you were uncertain about valuing banks and infrastructure companies. I said, welcome to the fold. Move forward 10 years. I still tell people everything I know about valuing young companies I learned in the process of valuing Amazon.com. Move forward 10 years. It's a crisis. This time a crisis caused by banks behaving badly. The 2008 crisis. The problem when banks screw up is we all feel the pain. A tech company screws up, it goes bankrupt, employees feel the pain, shareholders feel the pain, banks screw up, we all feel the pain. The cost is socialized. Why? Because we have deposits in banks, right? You never thought you were partaking in the risk-taking of the bank, but guess what? You are. Early 2009, somebody puts up and said, how do we value a bank in this world? Remember at the time, people were talking about regulatory changes coming and the entire world coming apart. Much of the way I think about valuing banks, I started to rethink and come up with in 2009. Again, in response to something happening out there, where I could not find an answer in the existing work. Let's close off the process. You get to the next decade, and you get the decade of what I call the numbers company. What's a numbers company? It's a company where the numbers that are most impressive are not in the financial statement. It's not the revenues, it's not the operating income. Let's take Facebook. What's the most impressive number at Facebook? Or Meta, as Professor calls it. It's not the revenues, it's not the earnings, because lots of companies, its revenues are small relative to Walmart or Amazon. Its margins are good, but Philip Morris has better margins. It's the number of users, right? If you take Facebook, how many of you have WhatsApp? Okay. Let's face it, right? Facebook and WhatsApp is a completely unmonetized part of Facebook still. If any of you are paying for WhatsApp, you're being scammed, right? So you're probably buying it from your friend, and the friend said $2 a month. He's collecting the $2. And Instagram, collectively, there are 3 billion people. Half of the adult population in the world is in the Facebook ecosystem. And here's a scarier thought. Last year, somebody did a measure of how much time people spent in different platforms. Roughly speaking, how much time a Facebook user spends in the Facebook platform? An hour every day. You have half of the adult population of the world on your platform 1 hour every day. Think of all the neat stuff you can do. It's a numbers company. 2017 again, somebody in my class. And you can see how things get triggered by somebody having a question about a company saying, what do we do here? Puts up his hand and he says, can we value a Netflix subscriber? Notice the question wasn't, can we value, because I'd value Netflix, the company, and he said, can we value a Netflix subscriber? Can we value a subscriber? What's the value? It's present value, the cash flows you will get. So what's the first step in valuing a subscriber? You have to estimate how long a subscriber will stay on as a subscriber. Is there a statistic out there that I can use to measure that at these user-based companies? Have you heard of churn rates? Churn rates measure how many of your subscribers you lose every year, or renewal rates are the flip side of that. Netflix. How many of you have Netflix? Okay. How many of you have canceled a Netflix subscription? 2. There's your churn rate, right? 3, 4, 5%, which means that a typical subscriber stays on for a really long time, 15 years with a 93% renewal rate. I'm off to the races. A typical subscriber stays on 15 years. What's my next step? To figure out how much money Netflix makes. And this is an easy business model, right? Those of you who have Netflix, and if you're pirating it from a neighbor, don't let me know. Okay? If you actually have Netflix, how much does it cost in Peru for a monthly Netflix subscription? $15. It's $24 for me, and already you can see that depending on where a Netflix subscriber is, it'll be different. But in 2017, Netflix was still US and Europe based, so it took about $18 a month, which is a subscription then. And then I allowed, so that's every month, and then we know from history that Netflix raises subscription prices, so I let it go up at the rate of inflation, and I got my expected subscription revenues. I'm almost there. I now need to subtract out the expenses Netflix has for keeping a subscriber. And it's actually very small. You're saying, what about the content they make? They're not making it for you. You might think they do, that there's a Netflix guy saying, what can I do for you? No, it's just collective content. So the content is a fixed cost, maybe $2 a month. It's the maintenance, which means $16 a month in profit per subscriber. And you're going to grow it at the inflation rate for the next 15 years. You have to pay taxes on that as a company, subtract that out. And you come up with cash flows per year. And then you discount those cash flows back. At what rate? Probably a lower rate than you would charge for the discounting the rest of your cash flows, because subscriptions are sticky and they're going to be a pretty predictable source of revenues. Bottom line, I valued a Netflix subscriber in the US at about $500 per subscriber. So if I'm still interested in valuing Netflix as a company, what should I do? I multiply that by the number of subscribers. Am I done? What's the rest of the valuation I still have to cater in? Is Netflix trying to sign up new subscribers still? So I have to add on the value they will get from new subscribers. And to do that, I need to bring in another metric, which is how much does it cost Netflix to acquire a new subscriber? We went through this process. We valued Netflix. I was glad I did this because it forces you to break a user-based company down into the metrics that matter. Right after I finished Netflix, I valued Spotify. I said, this should be pretty similar. It is, except for one big difference. How many of you have Spotify? Okay. You guys do a lot of watching movies and listening to music. You know the big difference between Netflix? They look like very similar models, right? Subscription-based. No, it's content. You know how Spotify pays for the content? You listen to a Taylor Swift song on Spotify. Spotify based on streams of content. So if 1 million people listen to your song, they pay based on that. Already you can see what this is going to do, right? If I sign a new subscriber, content now becomes a variable cost because that subscriber listens to music. It means that my value per subscriber, if I have Spotify, even if I have the same subscription revenues, are going to be lower than at Netflix. I would never even have thought of that if I hadn't dug in. And then I'm going to close off with the final company I valued. I valued Uber. How many of you have Uber? Okay, that kind of completes the picture here, right? You are the slave of subscription companies everywhere. Okay. Remind me again how Uber makes money. I know this is simplistic. How does it make money? I download the app to my phone. Does it make money because I have the app on my phone? No. For it to make money, I have to hit the app, call for a ride, and already you can see valuing an Uber rider is a lot messier than valuing a Netflix subscriber. Why? How many Uber rides do you take a month, do you think? 10. I take one a month if I'm lucky. My youngest son, I think, takes 50 a day. I mean, I've kept his, I've let him use my credit card as Uber because it's the only way I know he's alive on Saturday nights. On a typical Saturday night, I would see him take 7 Uber rides. I think he actually has an Uber driver take him to the bathroom, carry him back. But my point is, if I were to I can value a typical Uber rider, but with Uber, you can see that there are high-intensity riders who might be worth $4,000 a month, and very low-intensity riders like me are worth only $7. Now, do you see why Uber can never have a subscription model? What would happen if they introduced a subscription model? Who'll buy it? My son will. So you're going to so already you can see the answer to why do some companies have subscription models and others have transaction models. The more diversity there is among users, the less successful a subscription model is going to be. I took all of these, I did these as blog posts, each company separately, And then I pulled them all together to create a framework for valuing user-based companies. Again, something that came out of a question I was asked in class. I know this is a long lead, and you're saying, where is this going? People often ask me, what should I read in valuation? How do I get better in valuation? You know what the answer is? Stop reading. Stop watching other people talk about valuations. Value a company. Then pick a very different company, value that company. Then pick a third company, and each time you value a company, it's a craft. I mean, think of another craft, cooking. How do you master cooking? By reading cookbooks? No. Watching cooking shows? No. Because you can watch cooking shows and in theory you know how to whip up a souffle. You try that in the kitchen, it never gets whipped up. In fact, I still haven't mastered the act. They say, you have an egg, you whip it up till it stands up. That's what the cookbooks say. I whip it up, it's dead 15 minutes later. My wife can make it stand in like 2 minutes. You learn cooking by cooking. You learn valuation by doing. And what I'm going to talk about today is something that I do differently because, and the nature of a craft is you'll never master it. You can try getting better at it. So I'm going to talk about one aspect of valuation where I've had to work at the craft. And to set this up, you do two things. True. I did my first valuation in 1981. I don't even remember the name of the company. But here's how the process played out. I wrote to the company with a fountain pen. I wrote to the company's investment relations saying, can you please mail me a copy of your annual report? My kids are horrified. What do you mean you wrote to the company? Why didn't you go online and download? 1981, there was no online to download. To give the company credit, a week later in the mail, the physical mail, I got the annual report. I pulled it out. I opened up the annual report. In front of me, I had a ledger sheet. And a ledger sheet is just this piece of paper with lines already pre-drawn in it. That's the only innovation. And I loved it because I could never get the lines straight. It was a blank ledger sheet. To the left of me, I had a calculator. Not a slide rule. I wasn't that old. And to the right, I had a pencil and an eraser. I learned very early in my valuation life, don't use a pen. It's going to look really messy by the time you're done. When you value a company with a ledger sheet, a pencil, and a calculator, how many line items do you think there will be in your valuation? Remember, every single cell has to be hand calculated, right? You're going to think long and hard about breaking revenues into 5 geographies or into 3 products because every single cell has to be hand calculated. Valuations had to be parsimonious because you had no choice. You couldn't let the dazzle of your financial modeling stand in. So you know what? You had to tell your story about the company, and the valuation was a side player. Right? There was no, remember, you didn't even have projectors. So you didn't have to put, so you would actually have to tell people, this is why I think the company's worth. It was 1981. Last year, towards the end of the year, I valued NVIDIA. I had to because I had 1 quarter what I originally bought in 2018 still in my portfolio. So to value NVIDIA, I went on CapIQ. I have access to CapIQ. It's a global database. And I downloaded every single financial statement that NVIDIA has filed with the SEC over its entire 30-year life. It took me 1 minute. I had all 30 years in an Excel spreadsheet. And while I was in CapIQ, I downloaded the historical financial data for every semiconductor chip company in the world. And 5 minutes later, I had all of that. So rather than one physical annual report, I had every company's financials. So data has become so easy to get. I no longer use a ledger sheet, a pencil, and a calculator, though I could push came to shove. I have an Excel spreadsheet where I've already structured most of what already in I have more powerful models. So we have more data, richer data, and more powerful models. If I stopped right there and asked you, should valuations today be better than they were 50 years ago, what's your answer going to be based on what I've told you so far? More data, more powerful tools. And this is just my observation as an outsider. I think the quality of valuation has become worse over the last 40 years, even though we have all these CFAs and MBAs and Excel spreadsheets and data. And that puzzled me. I said, what's happening here? And my answer is valuation is no longer valuation. It's mostly financial modeling. You ask a banker about a valuation, they're giving you an Excel spreadsheet and doing line items of this is what we've lost the storyline. And I mean that literally. Because if you're just working with a spreadsheet, if your revenue growth rate of 15% doesn't work out, it gives you too low a number, what do? You change it to 20%. You get value that's too high with your existing margin, you just lower that. It's just a number on a spreadsheet. We've lost the story that puts these numbers together. So what I'd like you to do is play along with me, because I'm going to ask you a question that is personal before we go into the rest of the process. You've heard the legend of the left brain and the right brain? I've heard it's complete mythology, but let's stay with the legend because it sounds so good to start the process. The left brain, you guys should have the slides, or if you don't, you should get the link with the slides, so I'll make sure you get it. So don't try to take things down, you will not be able to, okay? Your left brain is supposed to control your logical side, linear thinking, numbers. Your right brain is supposed to be your imagination side. We all have left and right brains, but we all have preferences for one side or the other. So here's what I want to start with. I want you to start with that question. And before you do that question, there are people who are more comfortable with numbers. Did I jump a page now? And there are more people who are comfortable with telling stories. Let's say you are more comfortable with numbers. Okay? You're a number cruncher. You say, what's wrong with being a number cruncher? Each side has its own problems. If you're a number cruncher, you first have this illusion of precision. What does that mean? When in doubt, in evaluation, what a number cruncher does? Increase the number of decimals. It makes them feel more comfortable. Look, I have 4 decimals, 6 decimals, 8 decimals. The second is the illusion you're being objective. Look, I'm working with the numbers. What do you mean I'm biased? As if you can't be biased with the numbers. And the third is the illusion that you're in control. Look, I put a country risk premium in already. I don't have to worry about Peruvian country risk. Really? It was that easy? Just put the number in, the risk goes away? But for a number cruncher, that's your answer. I've dealt with the risk already. Why do you keep asking me about the risk? And if you're a storyteller, you have a different set of delusions. You think the number crunchers have no imagination. They dream in black and white. That's in your world. When they dream, they must have no color in their dreams. That you're the one who's capable of imaginative things. You think being creative should give you a higher value. Look, I told you a really big story. I must be worth at least 10 billion, right? And you love anecdotal evidence. Now I ask you, why are you doing this? What is the company I did 15 years ago where this worked out? Nice, but have you forgotten your statistics? A good valuation is a bridge between stories and numbers. And I'm going to be very explicit about what I mean by a bridge between stories and numbers. If you show me the valuation you've done of a company, an Excel spreadsheet, and I point to your revenues in year 10, and you have 10 billion in revenues in year 10, and I ask you, why are your revenues 10 billion in year 10? Here's the answer I don't want to hear. I don't want you to tell me that it's because you used a 35% growth rate for the first 5 years and 15% thereafter, because I don't even know what to do with that. I want your story for what this company does, what market it's after, and why you think that story can give you a revenue of 10 billion. When your margins in your valuation are 40%, why are your margins so high? I don't want you to tell me that that's what the average is in the industries. I want your story about unit economics in this business, economies of scale, something that explains why this company is able to deliver 40%. Every number in your valuation has to have a story attached to it. And conversely, if you're a storyteller, every story you tell me has to have a number that goes with it. You tell me a company has a great brand name? I can't pay dividends with brand names. Tell me where that shows up in your numbers. Where do you think brand name shows up in your numbers? What is it even? I mean, often when you have a doubt in valuation, the answer is not in valuation textbooks, it's in common sense and all around you, right? What is the power a company gets because it has a brand name? It gets to charge a higher price for exactly the same product. If you want to see brand name power at play, walk into a pharmacy. I know I've never walked into a Peruvian pharmacy and I want to start today. Okay? But I'll wager Peruvian pharmacies have the same phenomenon as other pharmacies do. Let's say you're looking for a headache. You're old-fashioned, you still take aspirin. You go into a Peruvian pharmacy, I'll wager that there is a bottle of Bayer aspirin you can buy. Bayer is, of course, the original pharmaceutical company but it discovered aspirin, 100 years ago. It's off patent, everybody can make it. And right next to it, and I did this last week at CVS in my neighborhood, there was a Bayer aspirin for $4 for 100 pills, and right next to it was a CVS generic version. I checked to make sure that it was the same thing, right? It gives you the ingredients, exactly the same for $2.40. I said, why would I pay $4 when I can pay $2.40? Because your headache seems to go away faster. This is what brand name does, right? It plays with your brain. It allows you to charge a higher price, which in financial terms, the bottom line is it shows up as a higher margin. You know, for every 100 companies that claim to have a brand name, 90 are lying. There's no brand name. They think they have a brand name. The best way to show them they have no brand name is you take their margins, you compare them to the rest of the industry, and your margins are not much higher. Stop talking about brand name. At one point in time, you might have had a brand name. It's gone now. Every story you tell me about a company has to have a number attached to it. If you get a chance, you might want to visit my blog and check out my Birkenstock valuations. Birkenstock, of course, is the German footwear company that makes really ugly sandals, but supposedly they're very comfortable. Huge brand name. Birkenstock, have you never heard of them? Yeah, they're like these ugly looking sandals. Celebrities wear them. And in the summer before Birkenstock went public, the Barbie movie came out. You're saying, what's the Barbie movie got to do with Birkenstock? Any of you see the Barbie movie, Margot? If you go back and would rewatch the movie, Margot Robbie is wearing pink Birkenstock in the movie. You know that Birkenstock sales jumped 30% in the summer after the Barbie movie came out. I valued Birkenstock and I said, there's a brand name, there's great management, there's celebrity clientele who wear your shoes without being paid, and there is this Barbie movie, and I tried to bring it all into my numbers. Because if you bring this in after the fact, you've lost control of your valuation. You know what I mean by after the fact? You value the company, you say, oh, but it's got a great brand name, I'm going to add a 20% premium. You garnish valuations with premiuming and discounting, you've lost control of your value. So with that lead in, let's talk about building a valuation. Before I go further into building a valuation, I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to look inward and give me the answer to the question. If I asked you to describe yourself as a person, would you describe yourself more naturally as a number cruncher or a storyteller? Think about it for a moment. Number cruncher or storyteller? What about you? Do you think more number cruncher, more storyteller? What about you? More storyteller? When did you know? Very early in life you start to know, right? Like in second grade, you look forward to the math class, but you don't want that social science class. It's like torture. I'll tell you when I knew. I was about 11 years old, maybe. My first English literature class. I was asked to read Moby Dick, and I did. And I came prepared the next day for a discussion of whales and captains. And about 20 minutes into the discussion, I noticed the teacher wasn't talking about the whale. I said, "When are we going to talk about the whale?" She said, "What whale?" I said, "Did I read the wrong book?" I distinctly remember a big fish all the way through the book. She said, "It's a metaphor." My jaw dropped. And the rest of the class was about hidden meanings and things I didn't even know had a meaning in the first place. I remember coming out of that class with a singular conclusion. I said, never again am I going to subject myself to this kind of bullshit. And I avoided the literature classes for the rest of my high school career. Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Algebra 3 out of high school. And you went and got a quant degree and you got a quant job and you hung out with other number crunching people and you lived your happy little life. But there were people in that same class who loved hidden meanings. They're the poets. My younger son is a poet. And I remember he wrote his first poem and he showed it to me, and I don't think he's going to show me anymore. He said, "Dad, what do you think?" I said, "Aren't the last words supposed to rhyme? Because my vision of poetry is stuck in nursery rhymes. The words don't rhyme, it's not a..." He said, "Dad, you'll never be a poet." I said, "Kiran, you're absolutely right. I will never be a poet." They love hidden meanings. They take literature 1, literature 2, literature 3. Then they go on and get a liberal arts degree in literature or history. They graduate and then discover a very unpleasant truth that a lot of story people find, which is if you get a job after a history degree, you don't get paid much. So after about 3 or 4 years of poverty-stricken wages, what do? They quit, they come back to business school, and they're sitting in my MBA class. So when I ask this, my typical MBA class is about 300. About 200 are number crunchers, recovering bankers, recovering engineers, recovering mathematicians, recovering scientists. And the other 100 are, recovering liberal arts majors, history majors, journalists. So when they walk into the class, you can already see the decision that they've made early on, which is the number crunchers think they have the upper hand. They said, "This evaluation class, what are you doing here? History major." So I've let them in on what I think is the biggest hidden secret in valuation, that is value. And I give them what my end game for the class is. By the end of this class, and I turn to my storytellers, my number crunchers, and I say, by the end of this class, I hope you're a storyteller with discipline, that you learn, you get comfortable enough. You will never be a number cruncher. First, you'll still be a storyteller, but you learn enough numbers discipline that your stories are bounded. Disciplined storytellers. Then I turn to my number crunchers and say, by the end of this class, I hope you start to trust your imagination enough that you become imaginative number crunchers. I've been teaching this for 60 semesters. Guess who I have more trouble with? Getting storytellers to develop discipline or number crunchers to let loose their imagination. Isn't even close. Number crunchers. You give me 100 history majors, I can teach them. Valuation is not complex. You can add, subtract, maybe even multiply and divide. You throw that in. You're home free, right? You don't have to do stochastic calculus. I can teach 100 history majors enough number crunching skills to be disciplined storytellers. With engineers, especially, it's like extracting blood from a stone because they've been taught their entire lives that being subjective is a weakness. Making a judgment without an equation to back it up is wrong. It's a psychological problem. I've seen people who take my class who still have trouble valuing companies because they've learned all the techniques, but they can't let go of this. I'm making an assumption of what if I'm wrong? Where's the equation to back it up? So I told you already, I started as a number cruncher. And for the first few years when I valued companies, I valued as a number cruncher did, which is I put numbers in a spreadsheet, I did the ratios, equations. And about 6 or 7 years into this process, I discovered I had a problem, an existential problem for somebody teaching valuation, which is I had no faith. Strange word to use, right? Faith. Let me give you some context. I don't value companies for intellectual exercise. I don't value companies for money because I don't do appraisal work. I value companies because I want to do what based on the valuation? Act, right? If I find something undervalued, I need to buy. And if I find something overvalued, I need to sell. And I did not have the faith to pull the trigger. I could value anything, but I couldn't pull the trigger. I said, what am I missing then? And what I was missing was the business storyline holding the numbers together. I had to teach myself storytelling. And the first time I did it was like the first time I cooked. Fire alarms went off. I had to order food from outside. But I learned something very critical about scrambling eggs, which is spray the pan before you scramble the egg, otherwise it gets stuck. The good news is it gets easier as you do it. I'm still a natural number cruncher, but I can tell a pretty good story. But it took a while to get there. So there's a piece of advice I should give at the end: work on your weak side. If you're good with numbers, work on your storytelling side. If you're good with storytelling, work on your numbers side. You need that balance. So in 2016 or 17, I said, you know what, this is becoming a problem in valuation of people putting numbers into spreadsheets, doing financial modeling. We need to talk about connecting stories to numbers more explicitly. And I wrote the book called Narrative in Numbers. It might or might not be available in Peru. But I'll summarize the book. When I value companies, I go through a 5-step process. I'll tell you why 5 steps and why in the sequence. My first step when you give me a company value could be Cementos Pacasmayo, which I have zero knowledge of before I value the company. It could be Amazon, which I've done 23 times before. My first step in valuing the company is to learn enough about the company and the business it's in that I can tell a story about the company. Easier said than done, but that's the first step. Second step, I stop and make sure the story I've told you is not a fairy tale. Is it possible? It passes. And then I push. I say, is it plausible? I call this the 3P test. Tougher test than possible. I have to show you that somebody somewhere has done something like this before. And then I say, is it probable? Which means I need to see some evidence that you pulled off something like this, even in a small part of your market. Possible, plausible, probable. That's step 2. Once I pass my story through those first 2 steps, I'm ready. Ready to do what? I take my story and I convert it into the inputs that drive value. And I told you, my first valuations were parsimonious. I've stayed with parsimonious valuations even as the data explodes in Excel spreadsheets. I have never valued a company with more than 12 line items, ever. And one of the reasons I keep my valuations parsimonious and my inputs under my control is it's easy for me to convert my story into inputs. And I'll show you what the inputs are that drive value. So step 3, I've taken my story, convert to inputs. Once I have the inputs, the valuation kind of does itself, right? It's not rocket science, it just feeds into the valuation. Step 4, my story has gone into inputs. The inputs have given me a value for the company. I'm tempted to stop after step 4, but I've learned that if I want to stress test my valuation, make it better, I need to show it to people who don't think like me. Probably not even in valuation of finance. When I valued Airbnb in 2020 when they went public. Is Airbnb in Peru as well? Yeah. They went public in November of 2020, during the COVID year. Okay? When I valued Airbnb for their IPO, the first person I showed my Airbnb evaluation was to a friend of mine who's a doctor, who's never valued a company, wouldn't know beta or cost of capital, would kicked him in the face. But he owned 4 Airbnb properties. And I wanted to make sure the story I was telling about the company and its relationship to the owners of the properties that rented, that I was getting that story right, that I wasn't missing some secret costs or revenues that were coming in. I call this keeping the feedback loop open. Listening to people who disagree with you. Why? Because you want to make your story better. So let's start the process by looking at step 1. First step, you sit down to value a company because you need to know what it does. What does it make? Why do people buy it? Why do people not buy it? So if you think Cisco makes vegetable oil, it doesn't, in case you're... I don't care how good you are at DCF, your valuation is going to stink. Right? So you need to do the homework of understanding. And already you can see why B2C companies, you know what B2C companies are, they sell directly to consumers, are easier to value than B2B companies. Valuing an Uber or an Airbnb was easier for me than valuing NVIDIA. Why? Because I've used Uber. I know how they make money. It's pretty easy to see. I've used Airbnb. Have any of you bought an NVIDIA chip directly? I didn't even know what an NVIDIA chip looked like, to be quite honest, when I first valued NVIDIA. I didn't know what made it special, what made it more powerful. It looks like this little piece of silicon wafer. So some businesses, now you can see why Cementos Pacasamayo is a relatively easy company. Have you seen cement? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever picked up a bucket of cement? Try. You'll pull your shoulder out. It's going to become the basis for any cement company storyline. It's so heavy that cement companies tend to be localized. It's one of the few manufacturing companies that China didn't disrupt in the 90s. Because China, even if it made cement at half the cost of Cementos Pacasamayo, by the time it shipped the cement to Peru, it would be more expensive. So cement companies tend to be localized. Take a look at even Cementos Pacasamayo. They get almost all of their revenues in Peru. Right? And that tends to be true for cement companies. You're saying, what if Holcim buys it? Can they send Swiss cement over? They can try. But there's no way Swiss cement will be even remotely affordable by the time it gets here. So first step is understand. So I'm going to take you through 4 companies to see this process play out. The first company was Uber in June of 2014. Time matters because obviously what you know about a company shifts over time. In June of 2014, I did not know what Uber did. You're saying, what do you do? Live under a rock or underground? Technically, I did. I lived in New York. I took the subway everywhere. I didn't use car service. But what drew my attention to Uber was a Wall Street Journal story that Uber had raised $3 billion from venture capitalists who had priced the company at $17 billion. It's a company I never heard of. People were paying $17 billion. And I was curious. It's a private company. It's not like I could invest. I was curious. I'd seen the word Uber on my credit card statements the 4 months leading into June of 2014 because it turned out that my second son was going to college in North Carolina, was using Uber and using my credit card to back it up. I don't know how that happened. But I thought he was taking German language classes. There's no umlaut on the U. Should have kind of given it away, but no. Yeah. So when I read the story, you know the first person I called? My son. It's 11:30 in the morning, but he was still sleeping. Why he kept what I call college student hours? You know what those are? It has nothing to do with the sun going down and the sun coming up. It's some different universe. You get up at some time, you go to sleep at some time. Not sure what those are. He was still sleeping and he wasn't even picking up his phone. So I called my niece who lived and worked in Chicago, and she had to be technically awake because she was working. But she was in a horrible mood. She picks up the phone and says, "What do you want?" This is how she greets her favorite uncle. I said, "I am trying to value this company called Uber. Do you know what they do?" She said, "They're a ride-sharing company." And I said, "What the heck is a ride-sharing company?" She said, "I don't have the time to tell you. Why don't you just download the app and find out for yourself?" Hangs up the phone. So I'm sitting in my New York City office. I download the app. I hit the app. Magical things start to happen on my phone. GPS opens up, and I see a car trying to drive towards me. Why trying? In New York City, you don't get from point A to point B. You just try. You go in the general direction. You go looping around. So I can see, and I can see the name of the driver, George. I'm fascinated. This never happened to me with a yellow cab. 15 minutes later, George and his car pull up in front of 44 West 4th Street, which is NYU's offices. I run out of the car and say, "Hi, George." He says, "Where do you want to go? You didn't enter a destination." I said, "Nowhere in particular. Could you drive me around for about 30 minutes? I have some questions to ask you." For a brief moment, he thought I was a serial killer. But then he decided, I can take this guy, get in the back. So I get in the back and I start asking him questions. I said, "Is this an Uber car you're driving?" He said, "No, this is my car." I said, "Are you an Uber employee?" He says, "I'm an independent contractor." I said, "Why do you do this?" He said, "I have a regular job. I don't make much money at it. I already own this car. This allows me to earn a second income." I said, "Why do you need Uber?" He said, "In New York City, it's illegal to stop on the streets and offer somebody a ride." And that's actually true. You can't be a gypsy cab. Uber connects me with customers. At the point, I could see why the guy did what he did. He already owned the car, allowed him to earn a second income. Uber connected him with customers. 30 minutes later, he drops me off in front of NYU. Offer to pay him. He says, "You don't have to pay me." I said, "It's free?" No, he said, "It's not free." "Do you enter a credit card when you downloaded the app?" I said, "Yes." He said, "They'll charge you." And I said, "How do you get paid?" He said, "They send me 80% of the fare." I remember asking, "Why 80%? He said, "I don't know. That's what they all do," and he drives off. At that point, I get a sense of why Uber does what it does, which is by connecting cars that they don't own to customers, they get to keep 20% of the fare. Which left me with one final question. Why do customers like Uber? So I decide to call my son again, this time at a more reasonable time for him, like 3:30 in the afternoon when he couldn't be sleeping. And he picks up the phone, and I put him on the defensive right away because he can extract more information. I said, "Brendan, I noticed you've been using my credit card to back up your ride sharing." I acted like I knew what ride sharing was right from the beginning. I said, "Why would you do that? You drove a car down to North Carolina. You have a car with you. Why would you need a ride sharing service?" He said, "Dad, on Friday nights and Saturday nights, I really like Uber." Now, as a parent, there's some follow-up questions you don't ask, like, what exactly do you do on Friday nights or Saturday nights? But I kind of got it. I said, "What do you like about Uber?" He said, "I can call the car from the bar." I said, "That's a plus." I said, "You must wait forever, right? They come faster than a cab." "It must be expensive, right?" So they're cheaper than a cab. Because the cars must be filthy, right? They're cleaner than a cab. That moment I realized that traditional cab service was destined for doom, that ride sharing would take over. Which left one final question, which is, why couldn't I buy an expensive computer, put it in my basement, connect cars to customers, and do what Uber did? And I had two answers. One is as to why I couldn't do it. One is $3 billion. They had it, I didn't. That's a bit of a problem. The second is, this is a business with networking benefits. You know what that means? As you get bigger, it gets easier to get bigger. If you're a driver, you want to go with the biggest ride-sharing company because that's where the customers are. In Silicon Valley, this is called a flywheel, which is as you get bigger, it actually allows you to kind of become a winner-take-all business. That was my research on Uber. You're saying, why don't you look at the financial statements? What financial statements? They were a private company. There were no income statement. I knew two numbers about Uber. How much they had is gross billings in the previous year, which they'd leaked, and how much money they lost, which is 1.8 billion, which they had also leaked. I remember when I did this, people said, how do you value a company without what exactly would the financial statements have told you about Uber? That it's small revenues, losing a bunch of money. I could have told you that without looking. I could have predicted what the SpaceX prospectus would include before. In fact, I did my first valuation of SpaceX before the prospectus came out. And I came dangerously close to what the actual numbers were. With young companies, there's not much there. So I didn't miss not having it. I'd have liked to have it just to make sure, but it didn't make that much of a difference. Let's take a second company. Before I jump into the second company, I want to make sure I'm not going to insult anybody in this room. Anybody in this room own a Ferrari? Now, the reason I ask this is I had a Chinese audience once, and I usually ask this question, nobody usually has it. And they go, it was in Hong Kong, and I said, anybody in this room own a Ferrari? 4 people put up their hands and say, you know what, I won't talk about Ferrari, okay? But let's start with the bad news on Ferrari. The bad news for Ferrari is it's an automobile company. You know why that's bad news? Every year, I do an exercise. It's a very perverse exercise where I take all publicly traded companies, which I use for my data, and I list out the 10 worst businesses in the world, because I break them down to about 100 businesses, the 10 worst businesses and the 10 best. And I'm not passing value judgments. Actually, I'm passing a value judgment, but it's not a fuzzy value. It's based on the numbers. And automobiles make the 10 worst business list. They've done it for the last 20 years. You want to guess some other businesses that are routinely showing up as bad businesses every year to be in? Airlines always show up. Telecom increasingly is there. Banking is flirting with being a bad business. You're saying, why would somebody be in a bad business? You don't start off in a bad business. You start in a good business and you slide, right? So let me back up that statement that automobiles are a bad business. In 2014, first, Ferrari's been around since 1948. You're saying, why did they wait till 2015 to go public? They were owned by a guy called Enzo Ferrari, and in the 1960s, Enzo got into a bit of financial trouble and had to sell 90% of Ferrari to Fiat. It stayed as part of Fiat for almost 30 plus or 40 plus years until it went public in 2015. In 2014, the most recent year, collectively around the world, and this is the advantage of having data, you can pull the data, all automobile companies globally, the revenue growth rate in the 10 years leading into 2015 was about 5.63%. It's a low growth business, and half of that growth came from China. So it's a low growth business. Second, if you look at the margins, the operating margins across automobile companies, the median operating, this is not net profits, this is operating profits, the median operating margin is about 4.5%. And 1/3 of automobile companies in 2014, which was not a recession year, 1/3 of automobile companies were money losing. Low growth, low margins. Let's nail the coffin shut. Normally, when you're a low growth company, you don't have to reinvest. You don't have to build new factories. That's not true for automobile companies. They're reinvesting, but not in additional capacity, but in R&D. See, what kind of R&D? If you have a new car, notice how much of it is computer in our car. It's been an immense, you take low growth, terrible margins, lots of reinvestment. How does it show up? It shows up as you earning a return on what you've invested that's less than your cost of capital. 9 of the 10 years leading into 2015, the car business has had trouble earning its cost of capital. So that's the bad news. Ferrari is in a bad business. What's the good news? Ferrari is not just another car, right? I'm not even sure it's a car, to be quite honest. There was a guy in the town I lived in, Chatham, New Jersey, before I moved to California, who owned a Ferrari. Never saw him drive it. It was kept in an extra armored garage with 2 security guards in front of it. You could break into this guy's house multiple times every day. You wouldn't notice, but his Ferrari was well protected. Rumor has it must be rumor because I never saw him do this, that he took the car out of the garage once every year, took it for a ceremonial drive around the neighborhood, and then drove it back into the garage. And who can blame him? Where are you going to drive your Ferrari? Can you imagine driving a Ferrari in Lima, parking it on the street, and going up for a meeting? All through the meeting, what are you thinking? Oh my God, my Ferrari's down there, my Ferrari's down there, right? And when you come back down, your Ferrari's no longer down there, but that's probably a blessing in disguise. It's a very impractical car. You see, but it can go from 0 to 200 in 6 seconds flat. You try going 0 to 200 on a Lima street in 6 seconds flat, you know where you're going to end up? In the back of the car in front of you, or into a stop sign. So why do people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a car you almost never drive? Because you get to be part of a very exclusive club, right? This is not a car. This is a club. You paid $800,000 to be part of that club. How exclusive? In all of 2014, the whole year, you know how many cars Ferrari sold? 7,255 cars. Just to give you perspective, Volkswagen and Toyota sell about 3 million cars a year. 7,255 cars is how many cars Volkswagen probably rejects on its assembly line every day. It's a tiny number. That's the bad news. They don't sell very many cars. Here's the good news. Their operating margin is 18.2%. Remember what the median margin was for an automobile company? 4.5%. They're at 18.2%. How come? What are the things that explain the high margin? One is high prices, right? The second is Ferrari spends nothing on traditional advertising. Have you ever seen an ad for a Ferrari that says 10% off, come on in? Don't wait for that ad, it'll never show up. They don't want the people showing up because it was 10% off. They sponsor the F1 races, so that's, but they do it, that's a very self-serving sponsorship because their brand and the reason people want to be part of the exclusive club is you're 45 years old, you always wanted to win a race. This is the closest you're going to get is to buy the Ferrari because you're never going to drive in an F1 race. And they have sky-high margins. They've been making these cars from the same assembly line since 1948. It's still made. And the reason they can do that is they're selling about the same number of cars every year, 7,000 to 8,000 cars every single year. And here's a final feature of the model. Normally, when you sell discretionary products, expensive luxury goods, your revenues tend to be more volatile because in good times, people buy that Gucci bag, and in bad times, they buy the fake Gucci bag, and your revenues reflect it. Ferrari sells to people who are so rich. You ask them, are we in a recession? You know what the response is? What's a recession? You used to be worth 7 billion, you're worth only 4.5 billion. I feel really sorry for you, but you're really not cutting corners, getting coupons. Their customer base is so rich that in 2009, they sold as many cars as they did in 2008. That was really tough to do. You see where this is going to show up, right? It's a high margin, low growth. Not because they can't grow faster, but the reason you don't want to grow faster is that guy who feels special because he feels a Ferrari feels less special if 3 people have Ferraris on the street, right? So your story has to factor that in. My story will. Let's move on. I'll be quite honest. I don't much care for valuing Latin American companies collectively because most of the companies are so incredibly boring in terms of storyline. I mean, take a mining company. Where's your story going? Hey? Bank, a Latin American bank, Bank Colombia. You know, you can try, but you're going to fall asleep while you're telling the story. Latin America is dominated by mining companies, financial service companies. There's not a whole lot of exciting storylines. You can already see why Mercado Libre fascinates and repels, right? It is a company that basically is a story. You can like it or dislike it, but it's not a company where you say, blah, I don't feel. You either hate it or like it because there's a story. So let's set up the storyline. I first heard of Mercado Libre because I don't shop on online retail sites in Latin America. I didn't run into it then. I ran into it because somebody, have you heard of this company called Mercado Libre? And I said, what do they do? And the way he described it, he said it's Latin America's Amazon. I said, really? So I went and checked the Mercado Libre site, and it's very clear that he doesn't quite understand what Amazon does because it's not Amazon-like. It's more like Alibaba. You say, what's the difference? Amazon actually is its own retail store. It sells other people's stuff as well, but it has inventory. So it operates as a retailer in addition to being. Alibaba is a pure intermediary. They connect buyers. They keep a small slice, and at least from what I saw, Mercado Libre it's an intermediary, which raises an interesting question. Why were they able to succeed so much in Latin America? Let's start with the market itself. The Latin American market is a pretty big retail market, overall 1.5 trillion, and about, at least the year, about 180 to 200 billion comes from online retail. And that number is growing. So they have a growing market, and because they cut across countries, rather than being focused just in Argentina. No. That online portion is growing over time. So I'm going to assume that growth will mean, so it's not like people can buy more stuff every year because you have only so much money in your pocket, but you buy more of it online. And Mercado Libre, I think, has crafted a very clever way that's allowed it to keep because in most markets, the online retail market, Amazon steps in and wipes out the local competition. Alibaba managed to fight it off in China, and Mercado Libre seems to have done a pretty good job in Latin America. So I started thinking, I describe Amazon as Thanos from the Avengers, right? And it destroyed the competition. So when you fight off Amazon, you must be doing something that allows. And the more I looked at Mercado Libre, the more it seemed to me that their competitive advantage was they'd built an online retail site that reflected how Latin Americans shop. I'll give you the Alibaba analogy. You know why Alibaba succeeded in beating off Amazon in China? It hit me when I saw The Economist described Alibaba as an online bazaar. I grew up in India. I grew up going to bazaars, right? Have you ever been in a bazaar? There'll be 6 shopkeepers yelling at you from different directions. Cheap, cheap, I'll cut 20%. It's pure chaos, right? But Asians are not just used to it, they like it. It makes it a sport, right? Shopping sport. Look, I played that shopkeeper against this guy. I got a really good deal. You try that in Sweden. Shopkeepers the customers will flee. They say, what is this chaos? In fact, to think about Alibaba's view, the way they approach retailing, think of Google, right? The entry, the search box. You get the search box. What else is in that page? There's usually a little drawing at the bottom, but it's a clean page, one box. Why? Because in the West, clean pages attract customers. Open up the Alibaba page. My advice is wear sunglasses. It's just chaos. It's like 100 different symbols floating around, but it fit Asian ways of shopping. And here's the second thing they realized. Amazon, to shop, you got to put your credit card on the side. They discovered that Asians, at least at that time, were wary of that. They were worried that it'll get ripped off. So Alibaba created Alipay, where you could deposit cash in an account and use it to buy stuff. Small things, but they tailored the business. And in many ways, if you look at the Mercado Libre model, they've tailored it to the different parts of Latin America, and they've done really well. And if you look at what makes them dominant, they've taken that initial entree and they've built the backing for it, right? They've built the logistics arm, because ultimately online retailing is only as good as the distribution centers you have. Amazon is successful in the US because there's a distribution center within 15, 20. I get most of my Amazon stuff delivered the same day because I live 15 minutes from a distribution center. I order stuff, 2 hours later, it's on my front step. Mercado Libre has invested heavily in distribution. They do spend a significant amount of money on R&D, presumably to make their... And finally, and this is the part that I think makes Mercado Libre both so potentially valuable and potentially dangerous, is they have a financing arm. And initially when I looked at the financing arm, I thought it was going to be like Alipay, which is a financing arm to help their customers pay. But their financing arm goes well beyond that. They basically are offering financial products to Latin Americans, and they're taking advantage of the fact that Latin America's financial product, so if you think like a customer buying mutual funds or investing or putting your money in a bank in Latin America, you're captive of whatever country you're in. You're in Colombia, you were basically did whatever Bank Colombia charged you, and there was no place to go. Bank Colombia charges, I think, 2% for a money market fund. That's highway robbery, right? It's a money market fund. But they can do it because so it's a big, inefficient market. Upfront, I'll say, the way the financial service market is structured, especially in the investing side, is splintered and inefficient. That's the opportunity. And Mercado Libre is going after it. What's the danger here? This is a business which is heavily regulated, and if you're not careful, you're going to very quickly get yourself into trouble, right? You expand lending to people, and you're not careful, what's going to happen? You're going to lend to all the wrong people and blow up the company. I heard Mercado Libre is starting to offer loans or credit cards, 3 months you don't have to pay to anybody who applies. It's a very dangerous way to grow, but so you can see it's a big market where if you play it right, could be valuable. So the end story here is that this is a market, and because they have this immense platform they built from their retailing, they can use that to try to offer other stuff that creates an optionality here. So my story here is going to be a pretty upbeat story based on that, but it's going to come with caveats, which is if they're going to grow in the future, it's going to be less retail, more financial products. And that's a trickier place to grow. One way to see how Mercado Libre has changed over time is to look at what's happened over its history. So what I did here was I went back to its start. It got publicly listed around 2005. And I broke its history down into two decades. Between 2006 and 15, its compounded annual revenue growth rate was about 37%. Pretty impressive. But its margins were 26.3%. It's almost entirely in retail, and they were almost in net. You look at the next decade, I'll give you the impressive number, the good number. Their revenue growth actually went up. You know how difficult that's to do as you scale up, to actually go from 36 to 4. So they've got the growth side nailed down. So I don't have any worries that this company will be able to grow. They're focused on growth. But you can see the bad news here, right? Their margins have imploded. At least the average margin over the decade is now down to 8%. Part of that was because around COVID they had a hit, but even if you take that out, they've scaled up the business, but at the cost of lower margins. Okay? That's going to frame my story. They can continue to grow, but I'm not going to give them 26%. They're not going back to 26%. Their basic business model has changed enough that if they're lucky, they might get to double digits, 10, 11, 12%, but that's going to kind of act as a cap. Could they become a higher margin company? Yes. But what do they then have to do? Lower the growth, go to niche markets. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You want to keep growing. The lower margins are going to be part of the story. Which brings us to cement. It's a global business. There's a cement company in pretty much every part of the world you go to. Why? Because you need to be local, right? And you're not going to get too many. It's a mature business overall. Cement is not growing 20% a year or 30% a year. There might be parts of the world where there's more construction, but it's also a very cyclical business. Why? Because building activity, which drives cement sales, is going to go up and down. It's the nature of real estate. It's heavy. Stating the obvious, but that means your companies are going to be localized. It's very difficult to. So if you told me a story about Cemento Pacasmayo growing by exporting cement to other parts of the country, other parts of Latin America, I'm going to have some questions about the story, which is how does the cement magically move itself? You're saying they could acquire companies in those countries? That's not. Then you're going to pay the price of growth, right? You're paying for it. Okay? And finally, if you think about cement as a commodity, unless it's being messed with, you know what I mean by messed with, they add stuff and the buildings fall down. Cement is cement. There's no high quality cement, there's no low quality cement, or the degree of, so you can't create a brand name. There's not much differentiation, which means your entire competitive advantage has to come from costs. Right? If you have two cement companies that you somehow have cheaper distribution system or a way of making cement that's cheaper, that's, gives you a cost advantage. And if you look at Cementos Pacasmayo's history, this is what you get. First, revenue growth is remarkably stuck. These are all in Peruvian soles, so it's in domestic currency. The reason I bring that up is there's an inflation component that's rolling around here that you probably have to take into account. Their gross margin, what does gross margin capture? What is gross margin? Yeah. Cost of goods sold. It's basically unit economics, right? If you're in a business where you have great unit economics, it shows up as a high gross margin. If you're a discount retailer, you know what the gross margins look like? 8%, 9%, which means your end game, because everything is down from there. If you give me the story of a grocery retailer with 30% margins, I have some real questions. How do you do this, right? So their gross margins have decreased, and this is a global phenomenon. The unit economics in cement, for whatever reason, have been under, it's like a slow motion meltdown. So they're not alone in this. The margins have come down. And their operating margins have also come down, albeit by less, because they have enough economies of scale. So what do you see in this? Right? It's a moderate growth company, single-digit growth, with margins that are under pressure downwards, not upwards. That's got to go into my story. You're saying, what about wholesome buying it? Let's hold off, because in a sense, this is the core company. Let's focus on it first. And then you can say, will this change if a Swiss cement maker comes in and buys a minority stake or a majority stake? The final company I want to use is Natura. I used to own shares in Natura. You heard of Natura? It's a Brazilian cosmetics company. It was a high flyer a decade ago, viewed as the next global Brazilian company. And I think they drank too much of their own Kool-Aid because they thought they were a global cosmetics company. They went out and acquired, cosmetics companies in Europe, and they bought the Body Shop. The retailer who sells expensive bottles, I don't know what, but they're expensive. Right? They had global ambitions. Okay. And Natura invested huge amounts of money to become a global player. They grew, but their margins collapsed. And in the last few years, it's caught up with them. The overreach has put them on the brink of bankruptcy. So about 2 years ago, they got a new management team in, and the end game now for Natura is they want to go back to being a Brazilian cosmetics company with relatively few brand names. It's almost like they're reversing a decade. So if you look at their history, you'll see that play out, because here's what the history looks like. Revenue growth of 16% from 2003 to 2010, 21.8%. And then you get to the last few years, when you look at the numbers, their revenues now are about half of what they used to be 7 years ago. They're shrinking back. Their margins, gross margins are always good. Why? Because you buy that perfume anywhere. If it's a brand name perfume, it's almost all pure profit. The bottle probably costs more than the perfume inside the bottle. But you're paying for the brand name and the supposed smell that's going to make you irresistible. And who can put a price on that? But their margins have collapsed because now you have all these fixed costs you created for yourself because you got overambitious. Now you see why with Mercado Libre, my worry is they get too focused on growth and they drink their own Kool-Aid. You could put a Natura in here, right? So I've set up 4 stories here. Let's talk about the next step in the process. Oh, one more thing. When you're valuing Latin American companies, there's a problem when you tell stories about companies because the country keeps intruding into your story. You know what I mean by that, right? You cannot value a Peruvian company without having a point of view of what Peru is going to do as a country, right? It's a pain in the neck because it makes every investment a joint bet on the company and the country you're in. And it's going to so with Mercado Libre, hovering in the background is what do I think of Latin America as a region long term? With Picasso Mayo hovering in the background is where will Peru go? And a few months ago when I was talking about country risk, I talked about why this is. Now I have a book called The Corporate Life Cycle that talks about how companies age and how they change. I actually took the corporate life cycle and I adapted it to countries. Countries go through a life cycle as well, right? You've got growth, you start almost a startup country where you're basically building from nothing, then you have growth, and then you become a mature country, and then you go into decline. Where would you put Peru right now? You better grow, right? I mean, you need the growth to get the economy growing. I mean, it might be fits and starts, but if you're in the younger stage of the life cycle, many emerging markets, whether they succeed or not, are there, then it's almost unavoidable that they will become part of your company's story. Because a company in that country then struggles with, hey, I will do well if the country does well, but if it does badly, it's really difficult to get out of that box. And if you think it's difficult to value companies in countries which are growth countries with all this risk, be glad you're not valuing companies in declining countries. It's depressing, right? You're looking at a population that's shrinking and aging. I mean, Japanese companies are tough if they have only domestic Japanese businesses because you're looking at an end game. That really is not great for the company. You don't have the customers to sell to. So one of the reasons country risk becomes so much of every company valuation here is because it's a player in the game. It keeps intruding into your game. So you learned enough about the company. You're saying, what do I do with it? You're going to tell me a story about the company. And you're going to tell me a business story, not a creative novel. So I have 2 pieces of advice. One is, when you're telling your business story, keep it simple. I'll give you an example of a story you should not be telling if you're telling a story for a business. About a decade ago, my oldest son, who's a big reader, he loves reading books, comes to me and says, Dad, I have a book suggestion for you. You should try this book. And I said, sure. I take my son's reading suggestions seriously. And he gave me this book and it was so hefty that if I dropped it on my toes, I'd have broken my toe. So I look at the book, it says, Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. And I read it. I tried to read it. Halfway through the book, I gave up. So I called my son and said, Ryan, I'm too old for this book. There are too many characters wandering around. They die, they come back to life. They're good guys, they're bad guys. I can't even keep tabs on any of the players in here. I give up. If you're telling a business story, don't make it Game of Thrones. You don't have 8 seasons and 80 episodes to tell your story. You have like 15 to 20 minutes. So keep it simple. If you're a tech guy, don't give me the tech details. Tell me the business story that you're going to do with your software or your app. And second, keep it focused. That's the end game for every business. You need to make money. You'd be amazed at how many founder stories I listen to. But for the first 30 minutes, the founder is telling you how neat his app is and how great it is and how many people have downloaded. And finally, I have to put up my hand and say, how do you plan to make money on this app? You're going to sell advertising? He said, I haven't thought about that yet, but let me tell you how neat the app is and how many people are down. No, this is a business, right? Keep it simple, keep it focused. So I'm going to take my own advice and give you the stories I told for Uber, for my 5 companies. With Uber, here's the story I told in June of 2014. And every word in this story is going to matter because it's going to affect my numbers. I described Uber as an urban car service company. I've already given away where I see Uber succeeding, right? In big cities or towns as a car service. I did assume in my story that they would bring in new people into the car service business, like my son and my niece, who would not take a traditional cab, would come in, so it'll expand the business. And that they would have local networking benefits. What does that mean? If Uber becomes the largest ride-sharing company in New York, there'll be a tipping point where it dominates the market. But in my story, Uber can take New York, Lyft can take Chicago, Didi can take Beijing, Grab can take Kuala Lumpur, and different parts of the... You see why this matters, right? When I give out market shares now, I've got to allow for the fact that you might have 7 or 8 ride-sharing companies around the world. And I did assume in 2014 that they could keep doing what they were doing, which is not own the cars and not hire the drivers. It's a business model. And keep paying only 80%. So that was my Uber story. You'll see it convert to numbers. With Ferrari, I assumed they would stay an exclusive club. You're saying, what choice do they have? You know what Maserati did in 2009? Maserati looked a lot like Ferrari leading into 2009. They sold about 8,000 cars, had margins of about 18 to 20%. But they really wanted to grow faster. They introduced a new model called the Ghibli. Don't get too excited, it's not that cheap. A cheaper version, it's like $200,000, to attract more people to buy the car, and it worked. Their growth went from 4 to 12%. They doubled their number of cars they sold over the next 5 years. You think this is good. But you know what else changed? You could probably help me out here. What do you think happened to their margins when they introduced the Ghibli? Because they had to advertise. The margins, which were 18%, went down to 13 or 14%. Did they have to reinvest more? Now you had to build more factories. You're producing twice as many cars, so the reinvestment went up. And now you are selling to people who are just rich, not super rich. And when there was a recession, they saw more. The advantage of telling business stories is I'm not going to let you take one input and change it just because you feel like it, right? Because if I let you do that, you will say, why don't I take Ferrari and make the 4% revenue growth into 20%? You say, okay, I'm willing to go along, but tell me what's going to happen to your margin, your reinvestment, and your risk when you do that. So I'm going to assume in my storyline that it's going to stay an exclusive club, which means revenue growth is going to be limited. Margins are going to stay high. They don't have to reinvest very much, and there's less risk in the model. For Mercado Libre, I'm going to assume they will stay in retail and fintech, which is where their strengths are. That they have strong competitive advantages, at least in the retail business. That they can grow. This company likes to grow. In fact, that might be their weakest link, is they're so focused on growth, and they will deliver the growth. But I do think they're going to struggle with margins as they grow. My story. And for Pacasmayo, I think they will grow, but their growth is going to be very much tied to how the Peruvian economy, Peruvian building activity, and you can't get around that. The unit economics are solid, but they've been under pressure, like all of the cement companies. And it is a capital-intensive business. So if they want to grow, they'll have to build those factories and distribution centers. The question, of course, is, does Wholesome buying the company change the story? What do you think? I don't see how, right? The consumer product company, maybe I can see a change where you can talk about branding and marketing and cross-market. So if there's any talk of synergy in this deal, I'm not buying it. I just don't see it. Cost cutting, maybe you think the company's not, that's nothing to do with synergy, right? It's control. How does one cement company in Switzerland buy a cement company in Peru and claim synergy? Where exactly is the synergy? The reason it gets used is bankers like to use the word. It's a buzzword to throw it into the mix, give an arbitrary, I think somebody said 40 million is what they're throwing around. It's complete fiction. They made the crap up. So my story is not changing. The one positive with Wholesome being in there is in a country like Peru, you worry about downside risk, right? Bad year, what if I can't make debt payments? You now have a deep-pocketed owner. That failure risk, if there is any, now kind of goes away. And maybe indirectly now when Prakash Meyer goes to borrow money, bankers might make the mistake, and I think it's a mistake of saying, well, Wholesome will back them up, so we'll charge a lower interest rate. The reason I think it's a mistake is when you're a lender, you should never lend based upon what some unseen sponsor somewhere else will do, but maybe it'll show. So I don't see the story changing much because of the acquisition. And as for Natura, I hope they're serious about focusing in Brazil and having fewer brand names. Because what will really destroy the company is the management gets ambitious again and decides, we're going to go global, we're going to do stuff. No. One of the points I make in my corporate life cycle book is companies that refuse to act their age are dangerous investments. Young companies that try to be mature companies that try to be young. So those are my storylines. Second stop, I want to make sure the story I've told is not a fairy tale. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? So I'm going to make this something I hope you can relate to, just to see the difference between the three numbers. I know Peru didn't make the World Cup this year. When was the last time they went to the World Cup? Not that long ago. So I'm going to ask a question. Let's set a long enough time frame. 2030 might be too close. Let's set 2038. That's a good. Is it possible that Peru could win the World Cup in 2038? It's possible, right? I mean, it's possible. You know, they haven't. They've not been knocked out for the next 4 World Cups already, so it's possible. Possible is an easy word. Do you see how it is? No. In fact, when you start at 64 teams or whatever you end up with by the time we get to that point, every team possibly could win the World Cup. Cape Verde could have won the World Cup, right? When the World Cup started. It's possible. Is it plausible that Peru will win the World Cup? Now I'm forcing you to think about now how many world-class players do we have? What kind of youth system do we have? Because these players don't magically show up. No. Where do they end up playing? You know, because you need to have world-class players. So you think probably not that plausible. And then I said, is it probable? If it's not plausible, then clear. And I'll tell you, in 2017, I was in Brazil. You know how Brazilians feel about soccer. And I asked this question, is it possible? And this is just before the 2018 World Cup. 300 Brazilians asked them, do you think it's possible that Brazil will win the World Cup? You ask 300 Brazilians 6 months before a World Cup, do you think they'll win the World Cup? Of course, they said, of course. We won it 5 times before. I said, is it plausible that they will win the World Cup? The room got a little quiet for a while. Yeah, we're second ranked in the world. If I'd asked the same question end of 2014, that room would have been a very shaky room. Remember there was a World Cup in 2014. It happened to be in Brazil. And Brazil got to the semifinals, and that's where the happy part of the story ends. They played Germany, and then I won't tell you what the score was, one of the shellackings of all time, at 7-2. But by 2017, collective amnesia had set in about the 2014. They said, it's plausible. We have a really good team. We're second ranked in the world. Then I said, is it probable that Brazil win the World Cup? And now you can see the mechanics. It depends on what group we get put into. It depends on whether Neymar stays healthy, whether he flips and flops and does whatever Neymar does on the pitch. And if this happens, and this happens, and this happens. With each one, you can see what I'm doing, right? I'm upping the ante and forcing. Think of valuation stories the same way. Is it possible is the easy part of the story. Is it plausible? I'm forcing you to think through the mechanics. What's a business like? What's a company like? What's a management like? Is it probable? I'm really asking you to put numbers down that you are willing to bet. You're not saying they're going to come through. You can be wrong, but you can make something of substance show up. Now, in fact, I don't do valuation, but I see other people's valuations come across my desk, banking valuations, private equity valuations. You'd be surprised how many impossible valuations I see, fairy tales. with big names on them, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey. I'll give you an example. In 2016, Tesla bought Solar City. One of the most hopelessly conflicted deals of all time. Why? Because who's the largest shareholder in Tesla? A guy called Elon Musk. Who is the largest shareholder in Solar City? A guy called Elon Musk. Who's the CEO of Tesla? A guy called Elon Musk. Who's the CEO of Solar City? A guy called Musk with a different first name, Kimball Musk. So they knew they were going to get sued. So what they did was they decided to get preemptive protection. The way you do that is you hire bankers to sign what's called a fairness opinion. Completely useless document because no deal in history has ever been stopped because bankers refused to sign a fairness opinion. You can always find somebody to do it. And to do the fairness opinion, you've got to back it up with a valuation. So because it was an exchange offer, the banker had to value both Tesla and Solar City to make sure the ratio was right. So I was looking at the Tesla valuation. It was done by an investment bank called Evercore, which is a New York City boutique investment bank. You know what a boutique investment bank is? It's like a gastropub. Airports, you usually walk by them, don't go into them. A gastropub is just a burger joint where they mark up prices by 300% and call it a gastropub. So boutique investment banks do what investment banks do, but they charge you 3 times the rate. So I have a core value Tesla. So I take a look just because I was curious. They had projected out cash flows for 10 years. They called it free cash flow to the firm at the end of year 10. They estimated it determined. They were clearly following a textbook. I don't know if it's mine or somebody else's. And then you get to year 10 and they project a growth rate of 6% a year forever in Tesla. My first reaction is, are you guys valuing the company in Argentine pesos and you forgot to tell me? You know why 6% a year forever in US dollars gives you a fairy tale? In 2016, the US economy in nominal terms was growing 3 to 4% a year. You put in a company that's growing 6% a year forever and an economy growing to 3 to 4%. Just work the math out. What's going to happen? The company will become the economy. Okay, globalization. You keep going, in about 20 more years, it's going to be the global economy. Now what? Interplanetary travel? This is where SpaceX might actually fill in the gap, right? You see how that can come in? After we're 100% of everything globally, here's what we're going to do. We will launch Teslas into Mars. I don't know who's buying the Teslas in Mars. This is a fairy tale. You know how much Evercore got paid to do this valuation? $9.5 million. There's no justice in this world. That's impossible valuations. Implausible and improbable valuations can happen, but you better give me a really, really strong story. Usually when you have high growth as a company, okay, you tend to have high reinvestment and high risk. You have low growth, you have low reinvestment and low risk. When I look at a valuation, the first thing I check are those 3 collective inputs. What I'm looking for is a mismatch. Here's a mismatch. You have a high growth company with very little reinvestment and very little risk. I have questions for you. Because it can happen, and really good companies, that's what they deliver. But you better give me the story for this company that explains why in this company you're able to grow without building factories or reinvesting, and you're able to do it in a way in which your customers keep buying your products and not pay. NVIDIA, for the last 5 years, has been able to grow at insane rates with relatively little reinvestment and almost no risk because AI chips, they're the only game in town. So the implausible and improbable stories, I'm looking for you to tell me a story that says that's okay. So in my Uber story, I felt pretty good about it because the story I was telling was a contained story, a car service company. And Uber is already succeeding. It's possible, it's plausible, it's probable. Could I have told a much bigger story for Uber in 2014? Yeah. And if I tell a bigger story, the onus is on me to explain to you why it's plausible and probable. I tell founders when they walk into venture capital groups, I say you have a choice. You can tell a contained story where you're in control, or you can tell this really big story. You know why they go for the really big story almost every single time? Because it gets them a higher price and more capital. But there's a risk you're running, right? You've set yourself up for something you can't deliver. Once in a while, though, you will hear a story that sounds so good, you want it to be true. Let me tell you a story. It's a story of a 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford. Who does that? You know how difficult it is to get into Stanford? Things like -3% acceptance rate. Gets into Stanford, drops out as a sophomore. To do what? To start a business. You're saying another tech geek dropping out to start another software company? Here's where the story takes an interesting turn. This is not a 20-year-old man, it's a 20-year-old woman who drops out to start a blood testing company. And here's what she's going to do. She's going to take the existing business where they take 2 buckets of your blood. I think last week I had to give blood. I think they took all my blood out. I had to lie on the ground till it came back. I don't know whether it's come. I asked, why do you need so much blood? And they said, feed Dracula. Yeah. And she's going to replace it with a new way of blood testing, which is she's going to take 2 nanotainers. That already sounds very 21st century. She's going to test for 42 different diseases and let you know within 45 minutes by email, and the whole thing will cost you only $50. I wanted this story. I hate blood testing. They take 2 buckets of my blood. It takes them 2 days to run the test. They won't let me know. They tell the doctor what it is. I have to go to the doctor a week later. This sounds like something I'd want to happen. This is, of course, the true story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. And were there a lot of people who wanted the story to be true? Yes. How do we know? Take a look at what the venture capitalists priced the company at. Okay? It was $9 billion for the company in June of 2015. And it wasn't just venture capitalists. Okay? The Cleveland Clinic, which is one of America's leading healthcare organizations, said, we love Theranos. Walgreens, the pharmacy chain, was going to put a Theranos lab in it. Everybody seemed to have collectively bought in. I remember in the middle of 2015, somebody asked me, what do you think of Theranos? I said, I don't know. It's a private company. I don't know much about it. But given the pricing and the Cleveland Clinic, Walgreens, there must be something here. I assume somebody in this group would have asked Theranos the question, which is, you're a blood testing company. What's the question you need to ask? Does your blood test actually work? Turns out that nobody had asked the question. Because in October of 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter decides to ask the question, and the results are actually in the public domain, because when you do these tests, they go to the FDA, went to the FDA and said, Theranos on their webpage claims that their nanotainers can be used for 42 different tests. How many of these have you approved them for? And they said 1. Why not the other 41? The FDA said the results are a little noisy. You know what a noisy blood test looks like? Trust me, you don't want to see one. This is what it'll look like. You might be dying, or you might not. Don't worry about it. Come back in 6 months. Of course you're going to worry about it, right? Noise in a blood test is not a good feature. You want blood tests to be precise. And in the next 6 months, the entire company unraveled. The $9 billion went to 0. Okay. Elizabeth Holmes was banned from the blood testing business. She actually was found criminally liable, and she's now serving in jail. She's supposed to get out in 2 years. I wrote about this in October of 2015 because everybody said, because after the fact, everybody's really smart. They say, oh, I would have known that. I said, really? I put them actually in a New York meeting or New York seminar. I don't even know what the right word to call it, where Elizabeth Holmes was the star of the show. She'd come in to talk. There were 3,000 people in the audience. Many of them were people bringing their young daughters with them because here was a role model, right? Somebody who wasn't, a social media model who was somebody who built a business. She was a role model. I said, put yourself in that meeting where you have these 3,000 people with 500 or 600 of them being 10-year-old, 12-year-old girls, and ask, let me know whether you'd have been willing to stand up at that meeting and ask the question, does your blood test work? You'd have felt like the guy who shot Bambi's mother. I've always wondered about the psyche. Have you ever seen Bambi, the Disney movie? It starts with the hunter shooting the deer and the rest becomes downhill from there. Because you'd have felt like killing a hero that all these people had come to see, right? Don't underestimate it. When people are buying into something big time, it's very difficult, even if you have doubts, to voice the doubts. That intimidation factor is huge. I call these runaway stories, basically where the story has a charismatic storyteller, you want the story to be true, and you stop asking questions. I saw it happen with WeWork. Horrifically bad business model. If you think about anybody in real estate looked at it and said, what are these guys thinking? What's a WeWork business model? Lease a building in the most expensive part of the city long term, and then sublease it short term. You know why this has historically never worked in real estate? Things look good until they don't. Like when you have a recession, what happens? All your subleases leave, you're stuck with the lease. I remember looking at the business model saying, what am I missing here? So I asked somebody high up in WeWork, what am I missing? He said, what you're missing is we're doing it in hundreds of buildings around the world. I said, you know what happens to a bad model when you do it in 100? You have 100 times the bad model, right? But think of how far that company went to actually going public at a $90 billion pricing. And what gave them that stamp of approval? What allowed people to say this company must be worth a lot? One investor actually would invest in one VC would invest in the company. SoftBank had accounted for half of them. Masa Son in 2019 was viewed as this visionary, brilliant man. They said, if he sees value here, why should I be asking questions about basic? I'm sure he's asked Adam Newman about these questions. And it turned out nobody had. It's one of those IPOs that completely melted down and failed. Oh, we can point that the syndicate that took WeWork included every single who's who on Wall Street. In fact, Goldman Sachs had a $95 billion pricing for WeWork. You know how they came up with the $95 billion? SoftBank had priced it at $47 billion before it. You can see the banker's mind working. Masa Son, he's a really smart guy. If he paid $47 billion for the company, it must be worth more. How much more? Let's double it. I know it sounds completely, made, but that's basically how bankers often price companies. How do they come with the nonsense for SpaceX? It's because Elon Musk said, I need at least 1.8 trillion. So, okay, we'll make that work. And you reverse engineer it and you come up with $135 per share. It's the way of the world. Yeah. One point that I think has some relevance. I know we're getting to the end, but the bulk of what I wanted to say I've said. But this is a point of that has relevance for what we're seeing out there with AI. About 10 years ago, I wrote a post that's now part of my book as well, called The Big Market Delusion. So here's how it works. You have a big market out there, potential. It could be China, it could be social media, it could be advertising, it could be AI, right? People see it's a big market. So what happens? You have ambitious, smart people saying, I can conquer that big market, founders. They found companies because they want to conquer the big market. And here comes in, through the side door, something that drives this process. Do any of you know founders of companies, entrepreneurs? If you do, let me ask you a generic question about founders now. Do they tend to be overconfident people or diffident people? You have to be overconfident to be a founder, right? You think so you have an overconfident founder looking at a big market saying, I can conquer that market. He or she goes to VCs. I ask you the same question about VCs. They tend to be diffident people or overconfident people? Extremely overconfident. They think they can pick winners, right? So you have an overconfident founder surrounded by overconfident VCs who funded that founder. You got a pod. The pod is going. What does that mean that they're overconfident? They're overestimating their chance of conquering the market, overestimating the revenues, overestimating margins, overestimating value, overinvesting. And what's happening in this pod is happening in 100 other pods, each of which has an overconfident founder, an overconfident VCs funding that founder, and do you see where this is going, right? If I take the values of all of these pods based on what the people in the pod are forecasting, what am I going to find? That the sum of the values is far greater than the collective value of the business. That's the big market delusion. They all build their business. Eventually, does reality intrude? Yeah. When does that show up? When you discover that that the revenues are not big enough for all of you to succeed. Some of you don't make it, some of you get less than you expected, and a few might be really big winners. But collectively, there's an adjustment. That's a correction. Big market delusions cleaning up. That's how bubbles are created and bubbles burst. This is why the AI bubble is a feature, not a bug. I've seen it happen with PCs in the 1980s. I saw it with .com in the 1990s, with social media in the first part of this. And it's happening with AI. Am I troubled by it? Not at all. Because I think it's good. This is how you create change. You overreach, you screw up. We complain about bubbles. Governments like to regulate. They will make sure the next bubble, be careful what you wish for. Bubbles are a feature of markets. And if you have growth and disruption, you should expect to see bubbles and corrections. It's the nature of the process. Now, the one thing about bubbles is please don't use debt as you're doing this, because then you're going to take the rest of us down. And that's not fair. You want to make the AI bet? Make the damn AI bet. Take an equity position. Play it the way it's supposed to be played. And that's been my biggest argument against private credit, which has come and funded a lot of data centers and AI. Is, what are you guys thinking? Why would you lend money to these things where they're not making money, there's no revenues or earnings or cash flows right now? So I call it the big market delusion, and there will be a correction. I'll skip this page. This is really a page on to show you that when you see a DCF from a bank, take a closer look. You'd be amazed at how often you see internal inconsistencies kind of pop through. This was a Tesla valuation, where the analysts had projected, this was early in Tesla's life, that the number of cars they would sell would go from 24,000 to 1.1 million. I was actually pretty reasonable. How do we know 1.1 million is possible, plausible, probable? What would you have to bring into the picture? First, you'd have to know how many cars were sold globally, right? It's about 85 to 90 million cars. 1.1 million is perfectly reachable. Even if you say it's the luxury portion, there are about 12, 15. So I said 1.1 million. Perfectly okay. I can live with that. It's an upbeat story. Yes, your margins should improve, which again, you can see the pieces. But you know what part of the story it fell apart on? If you look at the reinvestment across the next 15 years, this analyst was basically reinvesting nothing. He was putting in CapEx, but just to replace depreciation. I called the equity research analyst, a big name analyst in New York, and I called him after the report came out. He was at an airport going to California to worship, I think, at the Tesla's shrine or whatever he was going to. So I said, I've been looking at your valuation. I have some questions. He said, I can't answer the questions. I said, why not? He said, I have a team that does the valuation. I said, a team turned out this valuation? Yes, it's a team of 6. I said, can I call you when you're back? So a week later, I call him with his team around him. He gets on the phone and he says, I'm the lead analyst, but I don't do much number work. And I said, what do you do? He said, I schmooze. You know what schmoozing is? It's a Jewish word for talk. I talk to management. I talk to people. I talk. I said, okay, you're a schmoozer. So who's your second in command? He comes on and he says, I go with this guy when he schmoozes. He needs a companion, someone. And then the third guy is the backup schmoozer, one of the two guys. I said, who in this group actually does any work? And they point to this poor 24-year-old kid they hired out of Wharton 2 years ago. I said, he's the one. And I lead him through the process. He's a pretty smart kid. He gets it. I said, what happened? He said, it slipped my mind. I said, what slipped your mind? He said, when I was projecting CapEx and depreciation, I took the last year's numbers and I just projected them out. In the previous year, they didn't have much difference. And I said, don't you think there's a problem? Because they have one factory right now in California, Fremont, California, which has a capacity, full capacity of 250,000 cars. You see the problem here? You have 1.1 million cars and you're not building any factories. He said, I see the problem, but how do we admit to this publicly? Because it would be embarrassing. So I gave him a suggestion. He didn't take it. I said, have you ever watched Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory, the movie? He was too young, but one of the older. He said, yeah, I watched it. And I said, go back and rewatch the movie, especially the section with the Oompa Loompas. If you've never seen Oompa Loompas, go on Google, type in Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas is these little munchkins who have magical powers. As they dance, candy comes flying out of the factory. And I said, here's what you need to do. Put out a press release that Tesla has replaced all its Fremont workers with Oompa Loompas. The cars can come flying out magically. This is magical valuation, right? Where you over the number. So this is why you need to look at the whole package. You can't just look at individual line items. That can happen. Can the collection of things happen? It's a great way to develop your valuation skills. So last part, I took the story I told for Uber and Mercado Libre and I converted them to numbers. My valuations are driven, my cash flows are driven by three core inputs. I told you I have only 12 line items. There's revenue growth. That makes you small revenues to big revenues. Operating margins, that tells you whether your business is getting more. And the reinvestment you need to sustain that growth. So every part, whenever I tell a story, I'm saying, what does that mean for revenue growth? What does that mean for margins? What does that mean for reinvestment? It keeps my life simple and it keeps my valuations under control. So I took each of my stories and Uber story. And with the Uber story, the urban car service company gave me revenues of about 10 billion in year 10 for the entire market. And I gave them a market share that reflected my local networking benefit story, that they were 10% market share of this big market. So my revenues came from. So if you look at my Uber story, the Uber story basically is that they're going to end up with 10% of a car service market that is growing at 6% of 2% because it attracts people like my son and my niece. I gave them 40% margins. Why? Because they're an intermediary. They don't make the cars, they don't buy the cars, they don't pay the drivers. And they were able to grow with very little reinvestment because they don't own the cars. You're saying, where do you get your cost of capital? I'll tell you what I did not do. I didn't estimate betas and country risk premiums because it's pointless. It's costs of capital are not even making my top 10 list of concerns with a young company. So you know what I gave them? I gave them a cost of capital at the 90th percentile of all publicly traded companies. Start of every year, I create this histogram. It's on my webpage. I use it all the time. I want a risky company's cost of capital. I just give them the 90th percentile. That's what a risky company has, 12%. The value that you're going to see for Uber, and I'm going to jump forward, of $6.6 billion there, reflects my story. Any number you point to there, if you ask me why is that number what it is, I'm going to respond to the story. Why are my revenues $3.6 billion? Because Uber is an urban car service company with local networking benefits. Why are my margins 40%? Because it's an intermediary. Why is my reinvestment so low? Because they don't own the cars. Why is my cost of capital so high? It's a risky company. I finished this valuation in June 8th of 2008. I posted it on my webpage. It's Friday afternoon, 3:15. 15 minutes later, I get a call from the Wall Street Journal. There was a reporter, I think, waiting just for this to come through. She said, I noticed you valued Uber. I said, thank you for noticing. She said, I also noticed you valued it at 6.6 billion. I said, you're very observant. Then she said, you do know that venture capitalists have valued the company at 17 billion. I almost corrected her and said, venture capitalists don't value companies, they price them. What's the difference between valuing and pricing? Pricing, you look at what other people pay for similar things, right? So you look at other people and say, they paid 20 times revenues for young startups, we paid 20 times revenues. That's what VCs can't value $20 bill in a brown paper bag. They're incapable of doing that, but they can price things. But I let it slip that because she was a journalist. I said, I know they valued 17 billion. She said, how do you explain the 17 billion? I said, I don't have to, I didn't pay it. I've never felt the urge to explain what other people pay. You know how much frustration this has saved me in my lifetime? People say, how do you explain 61,000 for Bitcoin? Talk to somebody who paid the 61,000. Why are you asking me? And what business is it of mine if other people decide to pay 61,000 for Bitcoin? Or, yesterday I valued Nutrisa, which is a Colombian food, chocolate. I came up with a value 1/4 of the price. They said, how do you explain the price? I said, you guys paid the price. I didn't. Maybe you've gone crazy on the chocolates. Maybe they slipped some drugs in there and you go pay. I have no idea. It's not my job to explain what other people pay. But basically, that's why I describe this as my story, my value, my decision. I'm not going to tell you whether to buy or sell Uber. Okay? My Ferrari exclusive club story, low revenue growth, sustained margins, low cost of capital, delivered about a 6.3 billion euro value. Okay? But then again, it's a story. Every number there reflects a story. There's my Mercado Libre story. High revenue growth, because I think the company can deliver it. The margins are going to be stuck. I mean, and this is a pretty upbeat, as you go through. And basically, even if they can push the margins up, they're not going to 26%. I get to, I'm sorry?
Do you have a Bitcoin one?
Bitcoin can't be valued. Why is that? Because for something to be valued, what do you need? You need cash flows. Assets can be valued, and raises an interesting question. What is Bitcoin? It can either be a currency or a collectible. Can a currency be valued? No, it can be priced. That's what an exchange rate is. Can a collectible be valued? No, it can be priced, like gold. How do you price it? You price it based on either other collectibles, gold to silver ratio against inflation. So there are some things that cannot be valued, not because I don't have the guts to do it, but because they're not. So if you ask me, well, then how do I decide whether Bitcoin is undervalued or overvalued? You don't. You can decide whether it's underpriced or overpriced. You're a trader. And you can make a bet on will the pricing go up or not. Okay. So Mercado Libre is a company I would like to have in my portfolio. And I've had that, I've had a limit buy on it now for almost a year and a half. But it's never quite got there. It got really close. I think the limit buy was at 1,600 about a couple of months ago, got down to about 1,650 or something. But this is a company where I think, and the reason I'm willing to do this is not because I think that the company by itself, that I can, but it's part of a portfolio. I can live with it in my portfolio. And if I'm wrong, I can live with the mistake I make. And I'll close with Pacasmayo. All the numbers look like they're in dollars. They're actually, one of the problems I have with Excel is it lets me change currencies, but with euros, the currency is fine. The dollar gets replaced with euros. You pick any Latin American currency, it makes the dollar into 3 letters. And then I can't even fit it on my Excel spreadsheet anymore. So this is a valuation based on pesos, and where does it show up? My risk-free rate in pesos, in SOL, and it shows up in all of my inputs. And as I said, I got a value per share, actually slightly, but I was told that 6 months ago or a year ago, the price was lower. Then you could have asked me the question, how are you buying? Now, of course, the question becomes almost moot because it is, it looks like it's close to fair value. So I think that ultimately every one of these valuations reflects my story. And let's face it, there are lots of things I don't know about Cementos Pacasmayo. The Excel spreadsheet is, I'll put it online. You take it and you make it your own, right? So if you don't like my margins, you don't like my growth. I heard that as part of Peruvian regulatory law, this value now has to be assessed by an appraiser so that Wholesome can buy out the remaining shares. To be honest, I don't even see the point, right? It's this market price, but somebody will get paid for the appraisal. My guess is they'll come in and say, this looks like a pretty close to fair value, because there is a bias in the process. You want the deal to go through, there's too much money at play. So I'm preempting what you're probably going to discover. Because if you came back and said, this price is too low, let's cancel the deal, you're going to have some pissed off people all over the place. And as an appraiser, that's not good. So I am going to end there, but one final point. Can a story change? Can it break? Can it shift over time? Absolutely. Look at how the Natura story changed over 10 years, right? From being this high-flying, successful company to a company staggering. I mean, what causes change? Lots of things. And Latin America, it could be a macro shock. You can be a great company, but you're one macro shock away from becoming an average or even a declining company. And that makes it much trickier investing in Latin America collectively. And I think that's got to be factored into your story somewhere. Any questions? Yes?
How could you use climate change risk in our
Climate change risk. What's the risk of climate change?
For example,
Give me a company where because most companies, yeah,
a site which can be flow with product. And that's because of climate change risk that can be covered.
then put it into the cost, right? If it's something like that, just put it in, right? The places where climate change risk are going to be difficult to bring in where the connection to your revenues and earnings are going to be more difficult to make, right? If it's something that you see and say, look, that's going to be part of our costs, we got to bring it in, just bring it into your cash flows. Because no point talking about it after you're done with the valuation, because you missed your chance. So if it's something as tangible as that, bring it into your cash flows. Okay? Yes?
Did you value the FIFA deal?
Did I value Infantino's? I mean, that whole institution is so insanely corrupt. I wouldn't touch anything FIFA does with a 10-foot pole, because the only people who will get rich are the people involved in the deal making. I mean, I can see the rationale, right? Which is football does leave a lot of money on the table. I mean, I'll give you the classic example. Football is much bigger. Soccer is much bigger than American football. But American football is more lucrative than soccer, because every aspect of American football has been monetized. There isn't a single American football team that's worth less than $5 billion anymore because of that. And I think that's what's lighting up the greed lights in FIFA, is we can make so much money in soccer, but it'll come at a cost. It'll come at a cost because unlike American football, which is localized in the US, you're talking about 190 countries, poor countries, rich countries. And the minute you start to monetize it, things are no longer going to be even, right? You already see that with your players. I mean, Brazilian the local clubs no longer have the stars, right? They go off to Europe. Money is going to change the way the game is played, and for people who love the game for what it is, it's not an economic question, it's a question of preserving something that you love. So purely from an economic basis, I have no problem with the deal. I can see the money making, but I worry about the feedback effect of how it's going to change the game. Yeah. I mean, after all, the last World Cup was in Qatar, and don't tell me money didn't play a role in that, right? I mean, who puts a World Cup in Qatar? Yeah. But the answer, I think, is pretty obvious. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How do you solve the problem with teaching the
research to be more?
The question, well, I'll repeat the question. As a teacher, how do I get number crunchers to let loose on their imagination? By modeling it, right? Because I tell people when I make assumptions, now I am completely uncertain about this, but I have no choice but to make an assumption about what SpaceX revenues will be from AI. And I come back if I'm wrong on something and say, that's an assumption I got wrong. Because you can tell people till you're blue in the face. You have to be okay being wrong. But until they see you're okay being wrong, why would they take your advice? Yes?
Have you ever think of opening like a asset management company or asset management?
Do you want me to talk about active investing collectively? First, where's the value added, do you think, that comes from active investing? You're a portfolio manager, what's the value added? Because I can make what the market is making effortlessly with no cost, right? I buy an index fund. So as an active investor, you got to convince me you can make more than that without taking additional risk. That's at the core of it. Collectively, do active investors do that? Last year, 92% of active investors were beaten by index funds. 92%. Collectively, active investors earn 1.5% less than indices do. This is, if you are describing, I told you the airline business was a bad business, active money management makes it look like a superstar business. Active investing is just a broken business. And it's getting more difficult over time because the edges that active investors used to bring into the table 50 years ago, 40 years ago, or even 20 years ago are going away, right? 50 years ago, if you were an equity research analyst in New York, you had an advantage over me as an average investor in the middle of the country. Why? Annual reports were physically filed with the SEC, which had its offices in New York. You could go look at them. I couldn't. You had more powerful computers than I did. Your data was... So the edges are gone. So unless you tell me what you're going to bring to the table that's going to allow you to beat the market, I'm definitely not giving you 2 and 20, which I described as an obscenely bad compensation structure. But even 1 and 5, I have trouble because I don't see the added value. So it's not a great place to be unless you can carve a niche for yourself, right? So if you're entering active investing, you have to think about, what do I bring to the table? It doesn't have to be unique, but it's got to be rare. Something that you bring to investing that other people don't bring. And look for it. And if you can't find it, find another job, move on. It's not worth the hassle of staying in something where you don't think you're creating value. Yes?
Considering the new inflation numbers in the US, do you think we're getting normality rates?
This morning was 3.4%. I think it all depends on what happens in Iran, what happens. Almost everything that's happened in inflation is the oil price effect, right? So if oil prices go back to $65 a barrel, you're actually going to have deflation over the next year because you're coming off its year-to-year comparisons. So the question is, how much of this is built into the system? I think it's going to become a challenge for Kevin Warsh and the Fed if it stays above the 2% target, because if you're a central bank and you want to preserve credibility, when it stays above 2%, you got to act like it's a problem. And I think that's going to be politically inconvenient for him. No, but see. Yes?
There has been strength between last year and this year of music artists that are selling their rights to investment funds who are paying them factor amounts.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think these valuations are overpricing?
I guess if you're the investment bank monetizing this, you're looking for investors willing to buy into it. The advantage this goes back to the 1990s. David Bowie packaged all of his music and he issued bonds against the music. The advantage you often have in that space is people think they can predict trends in music better than the rest of the world can. So they tend to over exaggerate what a musician is going to do. I mean, there's no, to me, the musician, any set of cash flows is a set of cash flows. I would think it varies across music. Bruce Springsteen does it. You probably are willing to pay because of that. It's really, will that music still be listened to 10 years from now or 20 years from now, right?
Now we see that by or like people who
Yeah, and you can look at that, but it's predictable in the sense of, are people listening right now, right? The big challenge when you monetize these cash flows is, will people still be listening to Taylor Swift 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Not are they right now, a lot of people are listening, we know. But music is historically, there have been people, bands and musicians who've been at the top of the world, but 10 years later, nobody's heard of them, right? There are very few musicians who stand the test of time. And if you're issuing, long-term cash flows against that musician, you got to factor that in.
Professor Damodaran, quick question here. Sorry,
I can't-
it's here.
Oh, sorry.
So in one of the last podcasts with Professor Galloway, you mentioned this idea of 20% drawdown as a long-term cost. At some point of time, Warren Buffett mentioned like 50% drawdown that you have to experience if you want to be in the market. So what's your advice for us in terms of this idea of long-term costs, volatility that is going to arrive at some point of time, bubbles that are going to appear, and at the end, if you want to be involved in the market, you have to pass that. But what's your advice in general?
I'm sorry, what was the 20% for?
It was the drawdown that you're going to experience if you want to invest in.
Right. I mean, the 20% comes from looking at the history of US equities, global equities, probably greater. The standard deviation is about 20%. A bad year in the US is about 18 to 20%. A really, really bad market would be a little bit more. So it's a very simplistic way of deciding how much you're willing to be exposed to equities. You ask an investor how much is the most you're willing to lose, and they say 5%. Then you should have about a quarter of your money in equities, and the rest has to be in something that's money market or something close to cash. Will that number be different in Latin America? Yes. Yeah. I would say more generically, though, I think the problem is if Latin Americans stay, are you required to invest in Latin America? And the reason is some country, in Indians, whether they want, are restricted. They can't invest outside India. I know in Peru there are taxes that might act as impediments. I think those are bad because if you're a Latin American, I want you to invest your pension in a global index fund. Not in a Peruvian index fund, because one goes to hell in a handbasket, the other goes to hell in a handbasket, right? You kind of over-invest in you're encouraging home buyers in a market where that is going to be very dangerous. That's not going to be easy to sell politically because that'll mean money leaves Peru and goes to, I don't know, Sweden or Switzerland. You say, that's not fair. We need the money here. But I think you got to decide what pensions are for. Are they to protect your citizens as they get older? Are they to capitalize your company's growth? And you might have to decide which one is the leading mission here, because otherwise, I think, let's face it, much of the pension problem will go away. First, I allowed you forced retirement to be 5 years later. We're all living longer, and allow you to have a global index fund as your pension. Right? Yes?
I saw a quote from you stating that where you said that a Fed that is seen and heard from less is good for markets.
Fed should be like the old time advice with children, right? The less you see them and less you hear from them, the better it is, right? The reason is, the Fed has very little power. The only power it has, what's the only interest rate the Fed sets? The overnight borrowing rate between banks. When is the last time you borrowed at the Fed funds rate? Huh? We never encounter it. But you're saying, but it affects other rates. Does it? That's an empirical question. In fact, if you look at that same post, I look at short-term and long-term rates and the Fed funds rate, and it turns out that Fed funds rates go down after short-term interest rates have come down, and they go up after short-term rates have gone up. In other words, the Fed is less a leader than a follower, right? So that's your true power, your very little power, right? If you have very little power, stop yapping. Stop acting like you're going to be able to set interest rates. Stop giving me guidance. How the heck can you give me guidance about what you're going to do on rates next year and 2 years from now? Because that's going to be determined by the market. So do what you need to do, because the rest becomes just grist for the mill. You're making investors lazy by giving them the illusion that somehow you know what's coming. So do whatever your job is, which is collect the data on the economy. If inflation is high, raise the Fed funds rate or lower it if it's true. And then move on. Don't give me this commentary about why you did it or what you're going to do next month or 6 months from now. Because I think it's one of the most unhealthy things I've seen in markets is this Fed obsession. Every time I go on CNBC, first question I'm asked is, what will the Fed do? I say, I don't know and I don't care, right? But it's become almost everything you do starts, FOMC meeting happens, the entire market comes to a standstill while we wait for the Fed to make its decision. I think it's time we let go. But it's going to be tough because people have become lazy. They've become so used to being spoon-fed that they're going to complain. Let's see how much staying power Kevin Walsh has in doing this.
Don't worry, I'm going to be short. I have been asked to deliver these words to you because I teach valuation. I see many of my students and former students here. And I teach at both graduate and undergrad levels. And it's pretty much the same course as Professor Damodaran does. And of course, we use Professor's book as textbook. And also use his data, the data that he updates and uploads every month. And it causes two things. First, that I can promise, the value promise of my course is that I will teach them how to value, I will teach evaluation for the common man. No Bloomberg terminal, no expensive databases, just an access to the internet and Damodaran's website. And the other thing that happens in my course is that professor's name is every time is mentioned. Because, not only because, I teach the techniques for, estimating the market value of debt or the implied equity risk premium as he does, but also I always ask my students, where are you going to get the data you need to value once you graduate? Where are you going to get the beta, the unlevered beta corrected for cash for the automotive industry? Damodaran's website. Where are you gonna get the PE ratios of food processing? Damodaran's website. Where are you gonna get the country risk premium? Not Peru. The country risk premium of countries that no Peruvian has ever invested on, like Malawi and North Korea. Damodaran's website. So, Professors is a presence in our course, and as that. You know how we call him at my course? Taita Damodaran. Taita, professor, is a Quechua word that we use in Peruvian Spanish. In Taita, in Quechua, of course, is the language of the Incas, still spoken in the Andes. And it literally means father, but it's also used to refer to figures of authority or people that we admire, like village elders or community leaders. So, I'm an economist, as you know, and I analyze using revealed preferences. And I think that the fact that we use a word like Taita Damodaran, a word of respect, reveals how much we are grateful for your work and for your presence here today. And for that, on behalf of Pacifico Business School and Universidad del Pacífico as a whole, I thank you. Thank you for visiting us. Thank you for your work and for your generosity in sharing your work continuously for free to use for us. So thank you very much. Is there anything?
I just have to say that as I said, I spent the last year looking after my granddaughter full time. Because my daughter had to go back to teach. She's a school teacher. And I spent 8 hours every day for 9 months with my granddaughter. And my daughter now calls me au pair grandpa. So that's, so it's because I'm the nanny for the baby. And it's the best year I've had, the most productive year of my life in many ways. So that's something there's nothing more grounding than looking after a baby, right? Because you go back to basics. It's food, sleep, comfort, everything else is a luxury. So it was a good reminder of the things that matter. I still managed to get my risk premiums updated in July, and I will still do it in January. And I'm working on a Damodaran bot that was created. And one of the things I tried out at the start of this year is to get the bot to do it's a very linear mechanical process. There are 37 steps I go through in the first 5 days of every year to create my data sets. So I kind of let the bot watch me. And next year I'm going to try to get the bot to try to do the updating, because if it's mechanical, it can do it. Then I can turn it over and maybe the bot can keep it going. So thank you. Yeah.
El evento ha concluido. Muchas gracias.